Here are 5 unsettling stories of glitches in the Matrix that will make you question reality itself. These first-hand accounts blur the line between coincidence and the unexplained. I was 14 when this happened, and even now at 26, I still can't explain it. We lived in a small apartment in Mumbai, one of those old chawls with thin walls and neighbors you could hear through them. Every argument, every laugh, the traffic outside, the noise was constant, but it was home. That evening, my mom was in the kitchen. The smell of masala and oil filled the air. My brother was on the floor, crashing his toy car into the dining table legs. He'd laugh loudly every time his truck fell over. My dad was sitting at the table, flipping through a copy of Filmfare, probably reading the latest gossip about some Bollywood affair. I was trying to finish my chapati and bindi without getting dal all over my shirt. The noise didn't fade or pause. It just stopped, completely, like someone hit mute on the world. No sizzling from the kitchen, no toy car smashing, no shouting from the alley, just this heavy, thick silence. And then I felt it. Namaste. A soft whisper brushed against my ear. I froze. It wasn't just a sound. It came with the faintest feeling of breath against my skin, like someone was standing right next to me. My body went cold. I couldn't move. I dropped my chapati, and it landed on my plate. My dad looked up sharply. His face was pale, and he touched his ear like he'd felt it too. He stared at me, his hand trembling. "Suna tumne?" he whispered. "Did you hear it?" I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. Ma called out from the kitchen, her voice cutting through the silence, asking me what I was doing. Suddenly, everything came rushing back. The bhajia sizzled loudly. My brother's toy car hit a chair leg with a bang. Outside, someone shouted like nothing had happened. I jumped, the noise making my heart pound, but I couldn't stop thinking about that whisper. "Didn't you hear it?" I asked Ma, my voice shaky. "Hear what?" she said, wiping her hands on her dupatta as she walked out of the kitchen. She frowned at me and my dad like we'd lost it. Dad just shook his head and flipped the page of his magazine. "Kuch nahi," he said quickly. Nothing, but his hands were still trembling. For days, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The whisper, that cold, soft breath against my ear. My dad didn't say anything more about it, and I didn't have the courage to ask if he'd really felt it too. But sometimes, when we're alone, he'll look at me and ask me if I remember that day. He doesn't have to explain. I always know what he's talking about. Even now, I can't stand a room that's too quiet. When everything goes silent, I hold my breath and wait. Sometimes I wonder what I'd do if I heard it again. And sometimes, I wonder what would happen if I didn't. When I was 15, my best friend in the whole world was Chris. We were inseparable. You know the type. We'd spend hours after school in his house playing with his PlayStation. If I wasn't at his house, he was at mine. His mom called me her bonus kid, and I practically had my own seat at their dinner table. Chris lived with his mom. His dad wasn't in the picture. Chris never talked about it, and I didn't push. He had a knack for diving into his books when things got heavy. And I guess I liked that about him. It's like we both found comfort in our shared interests. One Saturday, I decided to drop by his house without calling. It wasn't unusual. I did it all the time. I figured we'd spend the afternoon working on this old monitor we'd been trying to fix. Maybe order some pizza and have a gaming marathon. I knocked on the door, expecting him to answer or for his mom to call out, and let myself in. But instead, a man opened the door, and here's the thing. This guy looked exactly like Chris. Same messy brown hair, same sharp nose, same serious expression he got when he was focusing on something. But he was older, like mid-40s older. He was wearing a hoodie and jeans, leaning casually against the doorframe like he knew me. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but weirdly intense. I blinked, confused. Is Chris here?" The man tilted his head, almost like he was amused. "You're looking at him," he said. My stomach flipped. "What? No, I mean Chris. My friend. 15. He lives here." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. His faint smile disappeared. "I don't think you should be here," he said, straightening up. His tone wasn't angry. It was more like a warning. "You've got the wrong house." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "No, this is Chris's house. We were just working on a project here last week." His face tightened. There was something about his eyes, like he was scared, but not of me. "You need to leave," he said quietly, and then he stepped back and shut the door. Not slammed, just shut, like he didn't want to draw attention to it. I stood there for a few seconds trying to process what had just happened. This was Chris's house. I'd been there 100 times. I knew the porch, the little wooden wind chime by the door. There was no way I'd made a mistake. Eventually, I walked away, my mind spinning. Maybe it was some weird prank. Maybe Chris's mom had a relative visiting who just happened to look exactly like him. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few hours later, I went back. This time, Chris answered the door, grinning like always. "Dude, where were you?" he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I've been waiting." I didn't move. "I was here earlier," I said slowly. "Some guy answered the door. He looked just like you, but older." Chris frowned, his grin fading. "What guy?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "He said he was you. Then he told me to leave." Chris just stared at me, his face pale. "That's not funny, man." "I'm not joking," I said, my chest tightening. "He looked exactly like you." Chris glanced over his shoulder, like he was checking to make sure the hallway behind him was empty. Then he stepped back, motioning for me to come in. He just told me I was weirding him out. I didn't push it, but the whole time we were sitting in his room, I couldn't stop glancing at the door, half expecting that man to come back. Chris kept his head down, but he wasn't his usual self. He barely spoke, and his hands were shaking. We never talked about it again. But sometimes, when I catch Chris staring off into space, I wonder if he remembers that day too. And if he does, I wonder if he's scared of what it means. Because I know I am. I've been a cop for nearly a decade, and I've seen my share of close calls. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever come close to what happened that night. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, even when you think you've seen it all. It was late November, and the frost had started creeping over the roads, making every turn dangerous. I was patrolling a quiet stretch of highway, stuck with this night shift as a reprimand for letting a speeder off with a warning the week before. That's when my radar lit up. A black Dodge Charger doing 112 miles per hour. I immediately flipped on my lights and hit the siren, calling it into dispatch. Unit 24 in pursuit of a black Dodge Charger heading southbound on Route 17 at 112. That's how we report it. Vehicle type, color, direction, and speed. It's not for drama. It's so backup knows exactly what they're walking into. The Charger didn't slow down. If anything, it sped up, weaving between lanes like the driver was in a video game. I pushed my cruiser as hard as it would go. But let's be real. Our cars aren't built to compete with muscle cars. For a while, it was just us. A straight stretch of road, no traffic, my sirens cutting through the cold night. Then, the Charger veered suddenly onto a narrow side road. I knew this road. It was bad, pitch black, full of tight turns and hilly enough to hide anything past the next bend. Worst of all, it ended in a T intersection at the top of a hill. No guardrails, just a steep drop into a dry creek bed. I stayed in pursuit, my tires squealing as I made a turn. I told them the suspect was now eastbound and the roads were icy, approaching a T intersection at the ridge. I glanced at my speedometer. I was doing 90. I knew that was too fast for the curve coming up, but I was locked in. I slammed the brakes, but my cruiser wasn't responding fast enough. The embankment was getting closer, and I realized with a sick feeling that I wasn't going to make the turn. All I could think about was my dog as I gripped the wheel and braced for the inevitable, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, my hands were still on the wheel and I was cruising smoothly down the eastbound road, the same road the Charger had taken. My speedometer read 45 miles per hour, like nothing had happened. No screeching brakes, no impact. just a calm drive down the same road. I pulled over to the shoulder, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't breathe and I was shaking, but I couldn't make sense of what just happened. Dispatch crackled back over the radio. Spike strips deployed eastbound. Suspect vehicle disabled. Driver in custody. I drove to the scene, still trying to wrap my head around everything. The Charger was stopped a mile ahead, its tires shredded, and the driver was sitting on the pavement in cuffs, looking annoyed, like this whole thing was just a minor inconvenience. Back at the station, I pulled the dash cam footage. I had to know what happened. The MDT showed a sudden gap in the footage, a 30-second black screen that I couldn't explain. When the video came back, my cruiser was already on the eastbound road, driving at a safe speed. There were no skid marks, no signs of a crash. It was like those 30 seconds just disappeared. I didn't report it. What would I even say? Hey, I think I might have glitched out of reality. That's not exactly going to fly with my sergeant. Now, every time I drive that stretch of road, I keep my speed under 50. It doesn't matter if I'm in a pursuit or just heading home, because whatever happened that night, I'm not risking it again. After school, I worked a part-time gig at a pizza joint on North Clark Street. It was always busy, especially around dinner time. My job wasn't glamorous. Most days, I was stuck spinning a sign on the sidewalk to draw in customers. It wasn't exactly what I'd call fun, but it helped Mom with bills, so I dealt with it. That day, the heat was brutal. I'd been out there for maybe an hour, flipping the sign and trying to make it look halfway interesting for the people passing by. I can't even remember what it said. Probably something about a discount. What I do remember is how dizzy I felt. The heat was messing with my head, making the edges of everything feel kind of fuzzy. As I spun the sign, a loud screech of tires snapped me out of my haze. A white van was tearing down the street, weaving between lanes like the driver had lost control. My stomach clenched as it got closer. It was going too fast. I stepped back, but my feet felt heavy, like they were glued to the sidewalk. The van jerked to the side and jumped the curb. It came straight at me. I didn't have time to react. The next thing I knew, the impact threw me back, slamming me into the traffic light. Pain shot through my chest and the world tilted sideways. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering was deafening, and then, when I opened my eyes, I was standing there, still holding the sign. The sun was blinding, the heat pressing down on me, and the street was calm. No van, no crash, just the usual bustle of North Clark, people walking by like everything was normal. I could still feel the pain like it had been real. I touched my chest, expecting bruises, but my shirt wasn't even wrinkled. I didn't have a single scratch on me. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe I'd gotten too dizzy and imagined all of it. I turned to head back into the shop, figuring I'd grab some water and sit down for a bit. But before I could take more than a few steps, the screech of tires ripped through the air again. I spun around just in time to see the same white van swerving out of control. It jumped the curb and slammed into the traffic light. Sparks flew, and the intersection lights went dark. People screamed, scattering as the driver stumbled out, looking dazed but unharmed. It played out exactly like I remembered, or dreamed, or whatever that was. The crunch of metal, the panic in the crowd, it was all the same. I stumbled back into the shop, shaking. My boss gave me a look. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I just need to go home," I mumbled. He just nodded and waved me off. That night, every time I closed my eyes, I felt the van's impact all over again, like my body was reliving it. It didn't make any sense. None of it did. But the pain, the sound, the sheer terror, it felt as real as anything I've ever known. The next day, I drove past the corner, just once. I couldn't bring myself to stop. Now I avoid that stretch of road altogether. Whatever happened that day, I've made peace with never knowing. Growing up, as one of 6 kids, life was always loud and busy. Our dad was a pastor, and back when he was alive, he ran his church out of this old repurposed factory. It wasn't much, a drafty, worn-down place with cracked windows and high ceilings that made every sound echo, but he made it work. We'd tag along with him on weekends to help out or just to run around while he got stuff ready for Sunday. The building was massive with all these nooks and crannies to explore. My brothers and I would spend hours poking around, climbing on the rusted machinery left behind when the factory shut down. But there was one room we always came back to. It was tucked at the very back of the building, behind the storage area. The first time we found it, I was about 11, and my brother Jake was right there with me. The door was this heavy, crooked thing that creaked like crazy when we pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark and cold, with concrete walls that felt damp to the touch. It was mostly empty except for a few wooden crates, an old desk, and some broken machinery piled in one corner. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old pipes or wet steel. Something about it felt off. Jake and I didn't say it out loud, but I think we both felt it. We didn't tell Dad. He probably wouldn't have cared, but it was more fun having our own little secret. Every time we went back to the church, one of us would say, "Want to check out the back room?" And we'd sneak back there, daring each other to stay in the dark longer or mess with the weird junk. It became our thing. Until one day, it wasn't. We were at the church one Saturday, helping set up chairs in the main hall. After a while, Jake nudged me and nodded toward the storage area. I knew what he meant, so we slipped away, weaving past old boxes and stacks of folded chairs until we got to the back. The door was gone. Not locked, not blocked, just gone. In its place was a smooth, solid wall like the door had never been there at all. Jake ran his hands over the concrete, frowning. "This is it, right?" he asked, though we both knew it was. The room was here. We started knocking on the wall, feeling for any seams or hollow spots, but there was nothing. No sign that a door had ever been there. When we told our siblings, they laughed it off. "You probably went to the wrong spot," one of them said, but we knew better. We'd been there a dozen times before. We knew every corner of that building. After that day, we stopped looking for the room. Something about it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to talk about it, let alone try to find it. Even now, years later, I still can't explain it. The building's long gone, torn down after Dad passed, but I can't shake the memory of that damp air, the faint metallic smell, and the way it just stopped existing.